It's time for the third Bloomburrow Precon upgrade video, Animated Army. This red-green deck does something that no other red-green deck has done in the past, and I'm kind of excited to see what we can do with that. But first, let's get into the commanders and see why I think this is something completely different than past red-green decks. Front-facing commander for this deck is Bloomburrow Bard of Brambles. For 1, a red and a green, it's a Raccoon Bard. It's a 3/3 that says, during your turn, each non-equipment artifact and non-aura enchantment you control with mana value 4 or greater is a 4/4 elemental creature in addition to its other types, has indestructible haste, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. I have never seen a red-green legend that animates artifacts and enchantments like this before in Magic. Usually this kind of thing is reserved for the blue color, unless there's some kind of massive downside, like the creature has to be blocked or something like that. And the design of Bloomburrow is actually quite brilliant. It's only on your turn that they animate, so it keeps them safe from a board wipe on your opponent's turn. They're indestructible when they swing in, so they can't be destroyed that way. And then you can actually just go ahead and let your wipes fly and clear the road for you to just go in and pound your opponent. It also allows us to slot in some Elementals Matters cards into the colors of this deck that help our animated threats since they are elementals. Other new commander that comes with the deck is an elemental wolf by the name of Wildseer Scouring Maw. For 3 red-green trample, enchantment spells you cast from your hand have Cascade, and it's a 6/6. That's it. It's just a single line of text, really. And I love the simplicity of this commander. If you've seen the trailer for the set, you'll recognize this creature. If you haven't seen the trailer, once you've done with my video, go and look it up. It's actually a really good trailer. But anyways, I love the simplicity. You just cast enchantments, and then you get free stuff off your deck. Cascade's always good and it's always powerful. My only issue with this deck is they packed it with your usual big fat baddies on top of these animation and cascade synergies, making it so the deck feels a bit split on what it really wants to do. So do you want this to focus on the enchantment and artifacts to animate and just or do you just want it to be a generic beatdown deck? Red-green is usually in the mold of just straight up thrashing our opponents in combat, so I want to bend this deck a little harder towards that elemental synergy, along with the animation of the enchantments with Bloomburrow and maybe a bit more cascading off of Wildseer. But that means we need to up the enchantment count, and I want to have room for those elementals as well, so let's get chopping on this deck. We're going to start with the elementals that I want to add to the deck, and to accomplish this, I'm going to remove most of the big fat creatures from the deck so I can get this thing to be a little more thematic, and that means our first cut is Itali Primal Storm. This card has kind of become the poster child for the big red beater that gets reprinted in nearly every precon since it was created, and it's not what we want for this deck. So instead, we're going to slot in Creeping Trailblazer. For a red and a green, it's an elemental 2/2. Other elementals get +1/+0, and for 2 a red and a green, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each elemental you control. Since Bloomburrow animates our enchantments and our artifacts into elementals, this will then buff them up in turn and can help buff up the Trailblazer with its own activated ability. Our second cut is going to be Ghalta Primal Hunger, another big fat beater going out the door to make room for an elemental that can become a huge problem that's even larger than Ghalta at times with Lavakin Brawler. For 3 and a red, it's an elemental warrior 2/4 that when it attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each elemental you control. With some of our other changes, this can become a massive problem for our opponents, especially since there are so many possible artifacts and enchantments to turn into elementals on our turn, and that would just make her huge. Without sounding like a bit of a broken record, here goes another big guy out the door, and this time it's Gramatha All Devouring. We have lots of other ways in the deck to draw cards, and I'm just not up for giving cards to my opponents with this deck, so instead I'm going to add an elemental big guy to the deck in the form of the Jelly Bean. It's Omnath, Locus of Rage. For 3 red, green elemental with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 5/5 red-green elemental creature token. And whenever it or another elemental you control dies, Omnath deals 3 damage to any target, and it's a 5/5. With Omnath out, we can have our elementals get into combat. Maybe your opponents have like a minus way of killing our animated enchantments or some way of getting them off the board in a destructive manner, even though they have indestructible. Maybe they have a way to make it lose the indestructibility. Omnath can punish them for that. And he's just a good, fun, big beater to go in the deck. And they're going to get blasted for the aggravation of messing with our elementals. The final generic big creature getting the boot from this deck is going to be Rampaging Baloths. Instead, I'm adding another elemental synergy in with Thicket Crasher, 3 and a green elemental rhino with trample and gives other elementals you control trample, and it's a 4/3. This one's a pretty straightforward and thematic redundancy for the Garruk's Uprising that comes in the deck to give all of our creatures trample, which can be pretty important in getting damage through later in the game. Now we're done adding the elemental stuff to the deck. Now let's get into some enchantments I want to add for this deck, both of the new legends, and since we've cut most of the fat from the deck, the Thran Dynamo is a little less useful, especially since the deck still has tons of rocks and ramp in it. So instead I'm going to add it. Ceticism for 3 green, it's an enchantment. Creatures you control have hexproof. 1 and a green, regenerate target creature. It's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. One thing lacking in this deck is a lot of ways to protect our stuff from like exile effects, especially from Bellow getting destroyed or exiled. So an enchantment that grants hexproof and it makes itself into a hexproof creature essentially that can also reanimate some of our non-indestructible things is actually a pretty powerful thing. Before I go on with the enchantments, there's actually going to be one more thing we're going to add to this deck as a protective measure. Just like with the Dynamo, we're also going to chop off the Hedron Archive. This would have been okay with the high cost creatures in the deck, but it's kind of overkill with what we're doing now. So once more, I'm going to look to add that protection spell to the deck, and we're going to get one of the best ones out there with Heroic Intervention. 1 and a green instant. Creatures you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Eventually, someone's going to try to drop something nasty like a Bane of Progress and ruin the game because they can do it on their turn, and your stuff's not going to have the indestructible at that point, and they're going to just completely blow you out. This stops them from doing that, where the asceticism couldn't do that. Getting back to the enchantments, the next cut is going to be a powerful card, but it's kind of out of place in this deck, and that's Tendershoot Dryad. This card just doesn't synergize with much of anything else going on in the deck, so it's going to get the boot so I can add an enchantment that is super dangerous for our opponents. City on Fire, 5 triple red enchantment with Convoke. If a source you control will deal damage to a permanent or a player, it deals triple that damage instead. So this thing will triple all damage output from all of our sources, and that includes all of these enchanted animated artifacts, and including itself becoming a 4/4 by itself. Pair this up with one of like the power doubling enchantment or the double strike enchantment that comes in the precon, and this thing is going to put on a ton of pressure. Now the next cut is a little bit harder, and I've been trying not to cut the purified planeswalkers, for lack of a better word here. But we have similar effects in the deck, and I'm not a big fan of Domri, Anarch of Bolas. I just don't like the card. I don't like the character in the game either. So instead, I wanted to get a new card in the deck that has a removal component like Domri, but also gives a similar pump as well with Hunter's Talent from the main set. 1 and a green, it's a class. When it enters, you can have a creature you control deal damage to its power to a target you don't control, so it's a bite effect. 1 and a green, whenever you attack, a creature gets a +1/+0 and trample until end of turn, so it's another way to give trample and a pump to a single creature. And then at level 3, at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Well, all these animated enchantments and artifacts are 4/4, so you're going to automatically get a card off of this at the end step. This kind of just gives us everything that Domri had going on, but also adds that card draw trigger if we level it up far enough. Plus, it's got a hedgehog on it. I'm sorry, Domri just didn't stand a chance of staying in this deck. Now, our next change is going to look a little odd since I'm trying to add more enchantments to the deck, but I'm going to remove one here with Outpost Siege. I'm not a fan of its effects in this deck, so I kind of want to try an enchantment that I've never seen before until I started looking into upgrades for this precon, and that is Dual Nature. For 4 green, it's an enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, its controller creates a token that's a copy of that creature. Whenever a non-token creature leaves the battlefield, exile all tokens with the same name as that creature. And when Dual Nature leaves the battlefield, exile all tokens created by it. Something I haven't really mentioned with this deck is that as long as Bellow is out, any enchantments and artifacts that you cast come into play as creatures, since it's a static effect. So Dual Nature will see this and give you an additional copy of that enchantment. And that includes itself, as it will enter as a creature, see itself as a 4/4 non-token elemental, and then generate a copy of itself. Sounds like a good time to me, because then anything you cast after that is going to give you 2 copies off of Dual Natures. And then our last cut for this precon is going to be a land, Evolving Wilds. With how much ramp and how many rocks are in this deck, after all these alterations I've already made, I think that losing a land is perfectly fine to make way for one of my all-time favorite enchantments with Mirror March. 5 and a red enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, flip a coin until you lose the flip. For each flip you win, create a token copy of that creature. The tokens gain haste, and then you exile those at the end of the end step. So I use this card to really good effect during its time in standard, and it's going to do the same for us here, since once again, with Bellow on the field, it means any of the enchantments and artifacts will enter as creatures, Mirror March will see them enter and trigger, and you'll get a temporary copy of each one of them for however many flips you win as hasty 4/4s with whatever the text the enchantments had on them, and that can add up or multiply out in some cases. So that's my upgrades for the animated army deck. What did you guys think? Let me know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, please like, share, subscribe. All those things help the channel grow. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.